Good morning. My topic is all about um, enterprise architecture model. And later, I discuss some architectural model or framework. So, what is an enterprise architecture? It is a bird's eye view of the enterprise, which shows strategic objectives, business, process, organizational structure, IT landscape, database, all at one glance, and puts a context to it. So two commonly used models for enterprise architecture are Sackman and TOGAF. An important part of the enterprise architecture is the information architecture, which is the art and science of organizing and labeling data, including website, intranets, online communities, software, books, and other mediums of information to develop usability and structure aesthetic. So, what is the Open Group Architecture Framework or TOGAF? So, it has origin in the DoD Technical Architecture Framework for Information Management or TAFIM initiative during the late 1980s to mid 1990s. This evolved into the TOGAF, which has been popular in the private sector globally. So TOGAF is an enterprise architecture framework that help define business goals and align them with architecture objectives around enterprise software development. So the TOGAF defines as a enterprise or any collection of organization that has a common set of goals and the purpose of EA to optimize across the enterprise to open fragmented legacy of process into one integrated environment that is responsive to change and supportive of the delivery of the business strategy. So, SOA or Service Oriented Architecture defines a way to make a software components reusable and interoperable via service interfaces. So services use common interface standards and an architectural pattern so they can be rapidly incorporated into new application. So this remove a task from the application developer who previously developed or duplicated existing functionality or had to know how to connect or provide interoperability with existing functions. So each service in SOA embodies the code and data requires to execute a complete discrete business function. For example, is checking of a customer's credit, calculating a monthly loan payment, or processing a mortgage application. So the service interfaces provide loose coupling, meaning they can be called with a little or no knowledge of how the service is implemented underneath or reduce the dependencies between applications. So control, objective for information and related technology or COBIT is an increasingly internationally accepted set of guidance materials for IT governance designed to assist in the implementation of effective IT governance throughout an enterprise. For an organization to be successful in delivering IT resources against business requirements, IT management should put in an internal control system or control framework in place. So the COVID controls framework contributes to these needs by making a link to business requirements, providing a set of business processes for IT management, identify the major IT resources to be leveraged. So this is our modeled in an enterprise architecture repository. So defining the management control objectives to be considered for each processes. So as you can see the diagram, the IT resources are the same as the current state and the future states of the enterprise architecture model. So likewise, in the main COVID diagram, the IT resources shown the center are modeled in the enterprise architecture repository. The enterprise architecture becomes the central repository for IT resources accessed by the COVID IT management process around it. So governance areas. So strategic alignment focuses on ensuring the linkage of business and IT plans, defining, maintaining, and validating the IT value propositions, and align IT operations with enterprise operation. Next is the value delivery. It is about executing the value proposition throughout the delivery cycle, ensuring that IT delivers the promised benefits against the strategy, concentrating on optimizing costs and proving the intrinsic value of IT. Next is the resource management. So it is about the optimal investment in and the proper management of critical IT resources, applications, informations, infrastructure, and people. So key issues relate to the optimization of knowledge and infrastructure. Next is the risk management. So it requires risk awareness by a senior corporate officer, a clear understanding of the enterprise's appetite for risk, understanding of compliance requirements, transparency about the significant risk to the enterprise, and embedding of risk management responsibilities into the organization. So performance measurement, so it tracks and monitor strategy implementation, project completion, resource usage, process information, and service delivery. Using, for example, balanced scorecards that translate strategy into action to achieve goals measurable beyond conventional accounting. So, business and EA goals. The following diagram illustrate how the enterprise strategy leads to business goals for IT. So, IT goals, enterprise architecture for IT, which are ultimately measured by an IT scorecard. Although these are very IT only view of enterprise architecture, which comprise both business and IT views, and it helps to understand the use of COVID with enterprise architecture. So, Sackman framework. In the early 80s, there was a little interest in the idea of enterprise engineering or enterprise modeling, and the use of formalism and models was generally limited to some aspect of the application development within the information system community. The subject of architecture was acknowledged at that time. However, there was little definition to support the concept. This lack of definition precipitated the initial investigation that ultimately resulted in the framework for information system architecture. So, although from the outset it was clear that it should have been referred to as the framework enterprise architecture. That enlarged perspective could only now begin to be generally understood as a result of the relatively recent and increased worldwide focus on enterprise engineering. So the framework of enterprise architecture as it applies to enterprise is simply a logical structure for classifying, organizing the descriptive representation of an enterprise that are significant to the management of the enterprise as well as to develop the enterprise system. Manual system as well as automated system, it was derived from analogous structures that are found in the older discipline of architecture or construction and engineering manufacturing that classify and organize the design artifacts create over the process of designing and producing complex physical products. So the framework graphics in its most simplistic form depicts the design artifacts that constitute the intersection between the perspective represented in the design process, that is owner, designer, and builder, and the product abstraction. That is what the material is made of, how process it works, and where geometry the components are uh, relative to one another. So who operating instruction is doing what work, when is a timing diagram, do things happen, and why engineering design objectives do things happen. In the older disciplines, some other artifacts were observable that were being used for scoping and for implementation purposes. These additional perspectives are labeled planner and implementer and are included in the framework graphics that is commonly exhibited. So in the more recent framework graphics, the end result in the case of enterprises, the enterprise itself is also include to complete the classification structure of the descriptive representation as well as the end result. The framework as a classification structure and its most generic form appears uh, below. So the older discipline of architecture and manufacturing have accumulated considerable bodies of products knowledge through discipline management of the product definition design artifacts. So this has enabled enormous increase in product sophistication and the ability to manage high rates of product change over time. Similarly, discipline production and management of enterprise definition. So it is the set of models identified in the framework for enterprise architecture. So it should be provided for an accumulation of a body of enterprises knowledge to facilitate enormous increase in enterprise application and accommodation of high rates of enterprise change over time. So although the framework for enterprise architecture or the Sackman framework is an application of framework concepts to enterprises, the framework itself is generic. It is a comprehensive logical structure for descriptive representation of any complex object and is neutral about the process or tools used for producing the description. So, like any good classification system, the framework is clean, normalize one fact in one place. There are no mixture in the structure. The classification is holistic, complete, and it's stable. The same classification on both axes has been employed by humanity for thousands of years, and it's not going to change for this reason. The framework is applied to enterprises, and it is helpful for sorting out very complex. So enterprises engineering choices and issues that are significant both to general management and to technology management. So in summary, the framework is simple. So it is easy to understand, nor technical, so purely logical. In its most elemental form, it is a five perspective. First is owner, designer, builder, bounded by scope and detail plus instantiation. The enterprise itself and six abstractions. So what, how, where, who, when, and why. Anybody can understand it. Second is comprehensive. It addresses the enterprise in its entirety. Any issues can be mapped against it to understand their primitive or composition within the context of the enterprise as a whole. So third is the language. It helps you think about complex concepts and communicate them precisely with a few non-technical words. So fourth is the planning tool. It helps you make better choices as you never are making choices in a vacuum. You can position issues in the context of the enterprise and see a total range of alternatives. So next is the problem solving tool. It enables you to work with abstractions to simplify to isolate simple single variables without losing sense of the complexity of the enterprise as a whole. Next is the neutral. It is defined totally independently of tools or methodologies, and therefore any tool or any methodology can be mapped against it to understand their implicit trades-off and degrees of completion. That is why they are doing and why they are not doing. So lastly is the raw materials for enterprise engineering. The primitive models when operational operationalized for enterprise are the design artifacts required for enterprise engineering just like the drawings, functional specs, bills of materials, and etc. are the design artifacts required to engineer any physical object. So, if the models are specified by the framework were operationalized for a given enterprise, engineering design objectives like alignment, quality, integration, flexibility, interoperability, reusability, and could be an operating reality employed to accommodate complexity and optimize the enterprise. The model, if returned and maintained, would serve as a baseline for managing change. So these are the uh, characteristic of architecture for anything. So architecture is not one thing. It is a set of things and in fact a set of 30 descriptive representations relevant for describing a complex object such that is can be created. Uh, that is engineered, optimized so it meets its design objectives and relevant for changing. So this is true for enterprises just as it is true for buildings, airplanes, automobiles, bridges, supercomputers, battleships, semiconductor chips, or any other complex object. So that's for my report. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.